Consider yourself waking up tomorrow and suddenly deciding to pursue one of the most difficult academic challenges in the world. You're gonna have to spend hours and hours of your days over the coming years studying, learning, and understanding advanced formulas and theories and concepts that are used at the highest level of profession. You're gonna stretch your brain to the furthest limits you can take it. That's what I decided to do with the CFA program. And like much of the best learning that human beings can do, the curriculum is not taught in a lecture hall. This great challenge of academic excellence has to be self-taught. So with that, I spent a significant portion of my early adult years just studying. And the single most important skill that self-studying will teach you is how to teach yourself. Today we're gonna break down the step-by-step process that I used to teach myself the most difficult topics and how to do it all well. There are many different topics taught throughout the CFA curriculum, but for the purposes of this video, we're gonna hone in on bond pricing through binomial interest rate trees as one example. The self-study steps that I used get applied the same way across every topic in the CFA curriculum. So right now we just need to talk about the principles. Those are the things that are gonna help you apply this in your own learning. The first step of this process is to place information in context. This is something that's been taught by many famous educators throughout history, and while this is not the area where the real learning happens, it can be a very important primer. Just make sure not to spend too much time doing this for every little topic you come across. To place the topic of binomial interest rate trees into context, we need to zoom out to fixed income investing in general and understand what binomial interest rate trees can help us accomplish. For me personally, I never really felt that the CFA curriculum helps to put the concepts it teaches into context. So I would just Google it. Spending 3 or 4 minutes on Google can tell us that binomial interest rate trees are used to calculate the fair value or the fair price of a bond that we may consider investing in. It will show you that to find the fair value of that bond, you're simply doing a string of formulas using the interest rates that that bond will pay you throughout time to get an answer for what that stream of interest payments is worth to you, what the bond should be priced at. What you will find by doing this is that putting concepts into context, in this example, in the context of being a financial analyst, will make it much easier for your brain to remember what it is that you learned about that concept. There are much smarter people than me who have talked about the reason this is, but it has to do with building more or stronger connections between the neurons in your brain when you're learning something. If you sort of know more of what the thing is that you're learning about while you're learning about it, the information gets stored in a much easier way for your brain to recall and recite and ultimately know. Placing material into context can also help you become more emotionally invested in it, which depending on your personality may act as another motivator to get you to want to learn it. The next step to this process is reading and comprehension, and this step really has 2 separate parts. The first part is exactly what this step says, reading the information or comprehending it through some other way. For me, many times that was through the use of video lessons. This is just like the first pass through the information. You need to go through the material. There are many different ways you can do this first pass through the information. For the CFA, as an example, I didn't find it helpful to read every single line in the CFA curriculum because it's very long and specific. If you're using a third-party test prep provider, maybe just reading the study notes or watching the video lessons are enough for you. You're just gonna have to figure that out over time. But the second part of this step is really where you will start to differentiate yourself from most self-study students out there. And that is by carefully identifying which of the concepts you do fully understand and which of the concepts you do not fully understand after the first pass. Doing this well is gonna take some practice because whenever you read through a logical concept, it's pretty easy to convince yourself that you know what was just presented to you and that you understand how you would have to apply that information later on. But a more efficient learner can really just feel the difference in their brain when a new piece of information gets downloaded into it, whether they truly understood that information and digested it versus if it just sort of made sense to them. It's a small difference, but if you can identify that difference when you hear or read something, it's gonna help. So pause and think about that for just a moment here. Really try to think of a time that you have learned a piece of information and some of it stuck and some of it didn't. You may not have noticed the difference in the feeling of the 2 pieces of information when they went into your head, but that difference of how it feels when you learn it is what you need to focus on learning to identify. I certainly suffer from hearing a new piece of information, thinking I learned it, and then the next day, or sometimes even 5 minutes later, not being able to recite it. Someone could teach me about why a certain mix of chemicals is a good or a bad idea to pour down my sink if I'm trying to unclog a pipe. And if the information they're telling me, it sounds logical and sort of makes sense, I'll go, oh yeah, okay, good, got it. But then the next day, if I had to explain to my friend why a certain chemical compound is not a good idea to pour down your sink, likely I'm not gonna be able to explain it correctly. As you get better at knowing when you fully comprehended something versus when it just sort of made sense to you, it will allow you to do a quick second pass over the information that you didn't really truly fully understand, and that's gonna set you up far better for the next step in this process. Step number 3 is practice. And you wanna think about this as 2 different kinds of practice, which I'm gonna call easy practice and hard practice. Easy practice is reading new information, probably an example of how that information gets applied in the real world, and then getting a question asked of you later that is presented in a very similar way to the example that you read through a minute ago, and then going, oh yeah, I remember that, the answer is C, and answering it, and you got it right, you practiced it. Easy practice can also come from the context that you set during the first step of this process. You may go, oh yeah, I remember the definition of this because I know what it's used for, done, got it. Easy practice can feel good because it's sort of affirming that you picked up on what you had just read, but it's not what's gonna make the difference. Difficult practice, on the other hand, is really where the bulk of your learning is going to happen. Difficult practice comes from slowly working through comprehensive questions and crashing and burning along the way. The reason that most of your learning has to happen here is that the human brain learns much more through application than just through reading or hearing something. When you're working through a problem yourself, there's a much different mental process. There's a much different engagement of neuron connections when you have to think about what was just asked of you, apply information that's stored somewhere else in your brain, know how pieces of information are going to impact that application of information, do all the work, and spit out an answer. So really, the more that you struggle during this difficult practice, the better off you're gonna be in the long run, because you will have been able to teach yourself more about the application of this concept compared to someone who was just able to recite something they had recently heard. Both forms of practice, the easy and the hard practice, should happen shortly after your initial reading or comprehension of the information. This has been proven to be an extremely effective way to study. And through this, you may also notice yourself becoming better at being able to identify the thing I was talking about in the prior step, that is information you fully comprehend versus information you just sort of heard. The 4th step in this process is to apply the topics that you're learning in various forms. Remember at the beginning of this video, I said that we were going to use binomial interest rate trees as an example, and there's a specific reason for that in this step. Working through binomial interest rate tree questions is inherently visual, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about if you've ever done them before. So with a topic that's visual by nature, it's easier to understand what different forms might look like in practice. But even topics that are not visual can certainly have different forms in the way that they're implanted into your brain. At least for me, I know that when I learn something and it sits in my brain a certain way, it can be really difficult for me to answer questions using that information, even if I fully understand the concept, only because the question is presented in a different way. It literally looks different than the way the questions looked when I was asked them in practice. It could be the exact same question, but if the words are put in a different order, or it asks about the information using different terminology, when your brain goes to recall how to do something, the connections between the neurons that have to exist may be harder for your brain to identify. So applying a certain topic in different forms can really cement the information in your head such that you'll be well prepared to apply it to just about any type of scenario that you may need to. The 5th and final step is to review. Now, I wish that my brain was like a computer, and once something is downloaded onto it, it can be saved there forever. But the reality is that my brain is much more like a golden retriever's brain, And when it learns something, it can get quickly distracted and focused on other things that seem more entertaining at the time, which ultimately just means you're gonna forget the stuff that you even fully understood previously. So even with performing all of these aforementioned steps, you're gonna need to go back and do really the hard practice once again. Maybe you'll need to do step number 2 again, which was the reading or comprehension, if through the hard practice you really don't remember what the heck it is you're trying to do. But for the most part, with review, you're just gonna wanna do practice of the concepts and ideas that you had done previously in the same exact way through different forms. And that's going to renew the knowledge of this information. You wanna do this review process relatively close to whatever the time frame is that you're gonna need to have to apply most of this information. And that's gonna let this renewal of knowledge be most beneficial to you. It's just going to remind you of what it was in a time when you're gonna most need it. So don't be like the golden retriever puppy who learned how to sit when it was 6 months old, but then never practiced it for 6 months, and then when it's a year old at obedience school, it totally forgets what it's supposed to be doing when instructed to sit down. At the end of the day, if you do all these 5 steps well and you become a self-study guru, what you're gonna be able to walk away with knowing is that you are better than just about every single other person out there. People who don't know how to study obscure concepts on their own sitting at home alone, those people are serious losers. There is no value in going out in society and mingling and building connections with people and fostering relationships. None of that stuff is gonna help you understand how to calculate a bond price using a random string of future interest rate payments discounted for potential call or put options. So don't be like the losers who have friends. Be like the geniuses of the world, the people who really make the world go round. Sit at home, apply the concepts discussed throughout this video, become a self-study master. That is what's gonna make you better than everyone else. Then when you unfortunately have to have conversations with these unworthy people in your life, you'll be allowed to talk down to them because they're inferior to you and they don't know how to learn information as efficiently as you will be able to. That's where the real value of knowledge comes from, right people? Thanks for watching. Have a good one.